I'd like to show you this film, which is not quite a film, but I mean, we're going to talk about it, called Recursion, and also show a bit like how it works in a way, which maybe you wouldn't do otherwise, normally, and what inspired it. And I'm kind of like, while doing that, I'm bound in this like triple problem of kind of working with technology that I'm not usually working with, so I'm not an engineer, plus I'm not a proper academic, plus I haven't shown this yet, right? So I'm kind of like in the middle of this triangle of vagueness, and I hope you kind of like stick with that a little bit, because I think it can also be quite productive, because the knowledge is not quite set, and I think the whole knowledge is shifting. So to frame this, I would actually like to quote Ben Bratton, who I work with in San Diego, because there's this quote from his piece on speculative design in this magazine, which I thought was quite interesting, that the real uncanny valley might be the one in which we see ourselves through the eyes of another, like an artificial intelligent other that we may have programmed, but which might not share our aesthetics or motivated interpretation. So this idea that we expect to kind of like find the uncanny in like the perfect simulation, but maybe the uncanny might be like the mirror that we kind of accidentally produce. And that's kind of the starting point for this piece. So I'm just going to show the work, and then we can talk about it. You cannot turn down the light, huh? Yeah, I think it's actually nicer. There's no rush. Okay.
Human in the supply and substance, the sense of the positive importance in the simple distinction of the good form of the economy and the study of the production of the model of the subject of the part of the sense of the reality of any social contract to the divine in a single interest of the power of the sense, of the consciousness, of the self-consciousness of its own self, which is the reality of the sexual self-consciousness, is the self that is the sense in the self that is the actual and more consciousness of the other, is not the way in this world is a self-consciousness as the I is its own alter. The self-consciousness is its own doing in the significance of its own essence, which is despite the reality in the present, the substance is the substance and the other, so that considerable to its experience, which we not the self as the self-consciousness is the substance, is this construction of this reality, which is a single individual and a self-consciousness as such in the self that is the substance in the ethical consciousness, is only the content of the behavior of the sphere of the same self of the other world, is the being of the century, the same time, the animals, and the actualization of the consciousness, the one, the standard of the scientific things, the action of the same time, the means of the self, is actually the doubt, the actuality of its own self at the self-consciousness, is a man, the existence of the behavior of the species, of the benefit and the significance of society and others, individuals, as the self-consciousness is the external, and the self of something further sensuous might be in the same time the actual world, the development of the strong thinking of the species of the self, and how the single individual for the sensations of the subject of the culture, each other.
So what you've just seen, and this is like, it's very technical description, and I said like I wouldn't normally put it that technical, but I think it actually makes sense, because the authorship is kind of muddled, and I'm actually quite interested in like who actually made what. So it's obviously like a 2-minute HD video that is my work and performed by somebody called Erica Ostrander, who's a sculptor and performance artist who also works with us, who just graduated from San Diego and who kindly agreed to perform this text. And the text was actually created by a recurrent neural network, which namely is the char-RNN by Andrei Karpathy, who's a scholar working at Stanford, and it runs on an open source framework called Torch. And that's kind of key, because yeah, the text was actually not written by me. The text was written by this AI system, and the AI system had been fed a range of texts about humanity, including all the Wikipedia articles on humanity, consciousness, economy, emotion, science, technology, human body, human behavior, part of Freud's civilization and its discontents, das Unbehagen in der Kultur, Joni Mitchell's California, the Beatles, Here Comes the Sun, Hegel's Phänomenologie des Geistes, Phenomenology of Spirit, Mary Douglas' Purity and Danger, and Brian Eno's Spider and I, which was kind of this like random set of samples, basically. And it's quite short and random because there were only a few days to make this piece. And the way that the system works is quite striking, actually. So it essentially, so I'm quoting Karpathy, the code implements multi-layer recurrent neural network for training sampling from character-level language models. In other words, the model takes one text file as input and trains the recurrent neural network that learns to predict the next character in a sequence. The RNN can then be used to generate text character by character that will look like the original training data. So what that means, and this is kind of like a graphical representation of one of these networks, what that means basically is that the way that the text is generated is purely probabilistic. So it looks at like the likeliness of one character following another character, and then can be used to kind of, once it's learned that, to generate words. And there's like a certain spookiness in how well that works. And I'm actually happy that there's no, well, you're an engineer, but my understanding of the whole thing is quite low level, actually. But what I find very interesting is that it's kind of this project of the neural net is almost like an epistemology of the mind. So as far as I understand, something like this actually goes back to the artificial neuron that we heard about yesterday, which is the threshold logic unit of Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts from 1943, which is basically a mathematical function conceived as a model of how biological neurons work. So it's kind of like a synthetic embodiment of a speculation of how the brain might work. And the way it works basically is that you train it and then it creates a file that then almost is an embodiment of this understanding. Yeah, so you have this thing sitting on your hard drive after like a night of analysis of this text. So on this computer, it basically took a night to crunch all these texts, and then there's a file, it's 8 megabytes. And essentially you can ask it like an oracle. You know? So you can say like, okay, start with this and then go. And there's different parameters, as you saw. So there's like so there's 2 layers, 219, I think, is data points, and then there's something called temperature you can use, which determines how kind of far how wild it's gonna get, basically, and that also determines like whether the syntactic structure might make sense or not. And this is like the layers. And the interesting thing is that this like probabilistic structure of that is almost like hidden in the thing. So it's kind of like it gets embodied in the thing, and you can ask it, but it's quite hard to actually take it apart, as you know, like to like reveal the structures. So it kind of gets combined in this thing. So that's the very technical side. And as I said, I wouldn't necessarily explain that if it were kind of like more natural or if it were just a video piece, but I think it's actually quite key to the work because. But on the side of like why is that interesting, or where the interest came from, that actually came from the Google AlphaGo versus the Korean human player that we heard about in the last 2 days as well. So there was a news item which unfortunately I cannot find anymore. I'm pretty sure it was on BBC News, but there's a very beautiful series on Wired actually that also comes with pictures by somebody called Geordie Wood, who made this like really interesting, like really beautiful photo series that focuses on the hands of the humans a lot. So there's like the human player and people kind of pointing at the board, and very interesting, very like Heideggerian. But on the 10th of March 2016, the second game, there was Move 33 that the machine made, and Move 33 was strange. Basically, it was deeply strange, and in this article in the BBC, there was one human who kind of was associated with one of the teams who expressed sadness and shock at this move, but the it was not because like it kind of moved the game towards like an eventual win for the system, but she's was a Korean person. She said like that the sadness and shock came from the inhumanness of the move. And this guy is called Fan Hui. He was the European Go champion who was playing against the machine the year before. And he's quoted as saying, "It's not a human move. I've never seen a human play this move. So beautiful." and there's something in there that I think is actually quite interesting. Somebody else is quoted as saying that there was like an inflection point for humanity. I wouldn't be so sure, but for me it kind of like stands in a line with a few similar things of creating something like through a model of what we understand a natural system to be. In this case, the mind, and there's obviously synthetic biology, to some extent climate science, of like the planetary system, and obviously it's also controversial. So in one of the other articles, somebody called Arns, who's used to be at the University of Washington, said that it's just math. AI does not beget autonomy. But there's also genuine puzzlement actually. So Stuart J. Russell, who's at UC Berkeley in the field of AI, says that there's like signals that are emerging from a slow process of research that like the researchers are familiar with, but they're still surprised by how suddenly things seem to come together and then produce something like this infamous Move 37. And the last thing I want to say is that I guess one thing that makes it interesting, and I cannot really delve deeply into it because of obvious reasons that you're going to see, we don't actually know what consciousness is, right? So we're working on something that we're not, and it's the same with life essentially. So if you look at synthetic biology and protocell science, you're trying to build something that you actually don't fully understand. And I thought the piece on consciousness on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is really beautiful because it is kind of like we don't know what it is. It's really urgent to understand it, and that kind of, without like delving into philosophy of consciousness, I think this kind of like clearly shows that there's actually something, we're working on something that we don't necessarily understand. I'm going to quickly read it. "Perhaps no aspect of mind is more familiar or more puzzling than consciousness and our conscious experience of self and world. The problem of consciousness is arguably the central issue in current theorizing about the mind. Despite the lack of any agreed on about theory of consciousness, there's a widespread, if less than universal consensus that an adequate account of mind requires a clear understanding of it and its place in nature. We need to understand both what consciousness is and how it relates to other non-conscious aspects of reality." So even if something like general purpose AI won't happen, I believe it's actually at least worth entertaining it as a speculative category, because something like that, or like this quest, has been going on, and its mathematization has been going on at least since the time of people like Leibniz, that you kind of like try to formalize something, to kind of then model it, describe it, and then the question is like, how well do you need to describe something for it to be functional in the world? And I think right now we seem to reach this threshold where it can become functional in the world, even though it's maybe not kind of like as general purpose as some people would like or fear it to be. So I think that's everything I'd like to say.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just going to go back to this.
So somehow you could say that the video you made, the Recursion, this is like an experimental setup to somehow you were hoping for the Move 37 to happen. So the move that is definitely not a human move, or what did you?
Yeah.
What was the goal of the experiment?
Kind of. I think so, yeah. I think that's a really good... and the funny thing is actually, and that's maybe why I'd want some feedback from you, because I think it's actually really difficult for a non-native English speaker to realize, to kind of get a feeling for what that text is like. So that might actually be something we can discuss. But yeah, I mean, I was interested in, and I'm still interested in, the possibility of things to emerge from not necessarily this, but like similar systems that are like fundamentally alien, you know, like that move 37 and is it always 37? That's really strange. There's also Snowflake 37, which is like a pivotal point in microscopy. And yeah, and I think there's a lot of kind of like what they call signals is like a very scientific term, but there's some things in the whole in the field of artists who work with these systems, or like there's quite a few works being produced that have that quality, you know, and that have a quality that kind of comes from a different place, even though it's obviously a place that we produce, right? Because like people create these systems, but still there's like and I mean, and I guess the answer is emergence, basically, right? There's like this emergence in the system that cannot be kind of predicted by even the person who makes it. And then the question is like, how alien is that, or is that maybe just a natural thing? Because that's obviously one of the most natural things there are. So it might just actually be like a misidentification by us, you know.
It actually would be my next question. So, do you believe in the singularity?
No. I think that's a very silly concept because it comes with this like pseudo-religious thing to it, and I don't know. That's definitely more sci-fi than anything else. But I mean, what I'm actually more interested in is like one of the other concepts that gets thrown around in this field, which is this idea of superintelligence, like the Nick Bostrom thing, who's obviously also very closely related to the singularity crowd. So that's this idea that intelligence is like a term as such, you know, that's not necessarily created to related to, it's a bad definition, but there's many ways of intelligence, and an artificial intelligence could be vastly, or for example, this Go system is like already like vastly superhuman, right? And this idea of, or this notion of like that there could be a point where like something enters this like runaway mode, you know, and maybe even has like some sort of agency in the world, and then there's this beautiful example of the paper clips, if you know that, right? That you could essentially tell a system to be like the most efficient at making paper clips, and it has some sort of like, it can cause things in the world, and then it turns the whole observable universe into paper clips because that's its mission, right? And it takes it really seriously. And so these things, I mean, not the paperclip scenario, but there's other scenarios I think that are interesting that would be like a technological singularity, but not in this like Ray Kurzweil way. I think there's a lot of kind of TED talking going on that, you know.
There was a question in the audience.
That's actually quite good anyway, because we wanted to open it up immediately also, maybe things that relate to other talks that could touch on this, so feel free to.
I guess my question is, do you think our fascination with the language that AI manages to produce right now is interesting mainly because it's incomprehensible, and in the same way that the film that was recently created with the actors, I can't remember the name of it, but with the guy from Silicon Valley, and it was like, it's so amazing. But if the same thing had been created by a human, everyone would be like, oh, what's going on? This is so boring, or what are they saying? And so I guess is perhaps the fact that it's created by a non-human, we prescribe a lot more meaning to it than it actually has.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's actually a funny comparison because that film is actually quite close to this work, and it came, and so my one is weird and incomprehensible because the training set was way too small. So there's amazing. So this Andrei Karpathy fed it, for example, the whole of Shakespeare, and it produces Shakespeare. Obviously not real Shakespeare, but like to somebody, like for a quick glance, it's pretty legit Shakespeare. I'm not sure about their film. I guess they also like went a little bit for nonsensical because there was like a comedy element to it. I thought it was great, actually. But I agree. I mean, of course, like something you create, you're more interested in than the kind of given, But at the same time, I think there's like the interest is also in the gap. The interest is also in the gap between the model and the target in a way, and as the model kind of like approaches the target, and the model being kind of a model of mind, uncanny is a very funny concept, and I think it works in many ways, also in the way that like Freud intended. It's actually a coincidence, by the way, that there's Freud in there, and I mentioned the uncanny, but I think it works in many ways that kind of also resonate with the weirdness of a text like that, and I think the enjoyment is probably also in the mirror, right? Because language is kind of at the heart of at least our conscious mind, It's not really an answer. I'm just thinking as I speak.
I think there's another question or statement.
I was just wondering, actually, can you pick up on your ideas of that gap? I actually have two questions, so maybe I'll make them quick. Only because I think the significance of a neural network is actually, once you get to a certain amount of layers, is no longer readable by a human, no matter how you unpack it. It's only readable by the machine itself. So the only thing the human can measure is what you input and the gap between what you input and output. So its actual processes, who knows what it's doing. But that sort of relationship to AlphaGo, I think, the quote about, is equally, I'm not sure what it was, it's like great move or bad move or, whatever. I forget what you said, but to me it sort of represents that tension because, and kind of what you were saying as well is the sort of equal fascination with AlphaGo is also the equally nihilistic view of humanity itself, because Go players are renowned in themselves because Go is not like chess. It supersedes chess. It's more of an art form, and it's an art form that's tied both to cognition and bodily movement and so on and so forth. And what we saw with AlphaGo was actually almost the subsumption of the extraordinary human ability to use cognition and mental ability that we associate sometimes with painters and so on and so forth. That ability to physically articulate a speculative space that is not there. But at the same time, this move 37 articulated that same moment. And how much meaning we put on the artificial articulating that moment, and not really actually saying that the moment of AlphaGo's move 37 is the exact same effectual moment as Kinney's. It's not that one sort of ranks and supersedes, but there seems to be, and I guess my question goes into just knowing the development of neural networks and deep mining is the concentration is on bridging the gap of performance, whereas when we consider the application of it against the human, the AlphaGo's player is not into increasing performance per se, but in superseding its own ability to grow. So
Yeah, I mean, you said it better than I could ever say it, but there's like two things that come to mind. I forgot the first one. But there's something really interesting in like trying to understand something that is not yet understandable, and then in the process producing something that's, technically understandable, but as you just confirmed with your background in engineering, like in itself also kind of not understandable, because you create this like network and then of like, you know, weights and probabilistic weights, and then there's something is really hard to take apart, which is also something that I would say gets echoed in a lot of biological things where like living things get manipulated, but they're still subject to evolution, you know, and then they live in time, and after a certain while something engineered might require additional science, you know, because it might have changed in ways. So there's also this notion of co-authorship that's actually quite strong here, which is quite interesting. And then the other thing is that there's an aspect of like toolness to it that's actually quite interesting. So the way, there's one longer article in the series where they talk to one of the engineers and how they, after this like move 37, essentially kind of like tried to figure out what the machine had done, right? And so this like almost like intuitive reverse engineering. So what did it do, you know? And then the way they explain it is that it's not only like one system, but it's like a series of steps, basically. So the way they trained it is that they essentially had it watch games, right? And then they had it play itself. So it essentially like used itself as a tool to become better, which is, I think that's actually quite remarkable as well, because there's a certain, yeah, I mean, and then there's another network on top of that that basically uses the results of that to think into the future, you know? And both these things are actually almost at the border of what we identify with, like things that are quite like privileged human things. So I work with people in San Diego who look at the origins of, or the concept of humanity in this term, kind of under the bracket of anthropogeny, you know, like and there's like a kind of understanding that like the use of tools and the use of future thinking, you know, it's actually primates don't necessarily do that, you know. So basically the machine kind of does that, you know. So there's something in there.
Well, I think that kind of leads to my second question, if I may, just really quickly, because it's kind of like a recursive loop. So first you have the machine, first you have the human programming the machine to simulate other humans, and then now the other humans are trying to simulate the machine, which will in turn try to simulate them. So I think it's a pretty optimistic and fascinating moment about the co-production of, you know, of both, you know, humans and machine, but into something else that who knows what it'll be. But it sort of leads to a second question about your video, because in a way it was like neural network inception, because you have the performer, the machine is, the network is simulating human speech, but the performer is simulating the machine's speech. And how, I'm just wondering aesthetically, as an artist, how do you view that recursion? It's because it's multi-layered of the same imitations.
I mean, obviously the reason for the title, because it's called recursion, right? So the idea was to, and it's actually interesting how that developed, because I mean, she was obviously reading the text, and it really worked best when it was like slightly too fast for her. And you can actually see that when she kind of has to like stop and kind of like, you know, kind of swallow. To breathe, really, yeah. So there's like this, and that's obviously so the idea was to kind of actually also push her to the limits of kind of almost like this roboticness, you know, and that's like the recursion that's in there is kind of then like there's a double recursion. So one recursion is that the system trained on texts about humanity. So there's this kind of like reverse gaze, you know, that may or may not work, which I said I cannot really gauge how weird the text is, and obviously the training set was really small, so it doesn't really make sense. It's more like it's almost like an expressionistic approach to that. And then the second recursion, as you said, is actually that she, in a way, as a performer, becomes the robot at the mercy is the wrong word, but at the kind of, you know, the machine is like gives the pace, which kind of then you can relate it to other Marxian things you'd like, but that was not necessarily intended. But this kind of like, you know, I mean, you also get like, if you have two mirrors, you get like the refraction. There's also another motive in there.
more questions.
You wanted to, yeah.
I'm very interested in the idea of language being a fairly alien thing in the first place, and the writer and also the speaking of it. I sort of feel a faint similarity just with sort of having, the reading of the script that I do, which is as automatic as possible. But there is an aspect of you have to remember to breathe, otherwise you're going to pass out, whereas the machine's going to keep going. But there's a very complex relationship, I think, that we have with language already. You sort of read other people's writing as your own ideas. You forget what you've written when you're writing, and you really, and you come across it again as if it's somebody else's. It could be somebody else's text. It's almost without memory of it, and I think that's completely normal. And then I'm slightly curious about this idea, Raymond, about the painter. This sort of originary spark sort of idea, which I'm curious about, because it seems a very human conception of something that's quite romantic, that has a sort of investment in us continuing in a certain way as a human. It's invested in that romantic vision, I guess, of the painter, if you like. And I would question what that is when it arrived on the scene historically, and why we'd want to necessarily keep hold of that, I guess. But also the way in which this sort of what's the word? We're sort of recalibrating, aren't we, what it is to be human in response as well. There's this constant recalibrating that's going on, that's thinking through, okay, well, what is it about us that's different from what the machine can produce, say, on a very basic level of, well, if it's knowledge production, it can autonomously produce knowledge, then what are we then in relation to that? Because this was a defining factor for a while. And then and this is where the painter, I think, comes into this as well, because this could be a defining factor of this sort of originary spark, but it's not dissimilar to the production of knowledge either. And it's curious.
I mean, the more this kind of like debate kind of like progresses, because it's like directly also tied into the future of labor and these things, right? I mean, like if you go downstairs, there's this like business magazine with the cover, this is like Danke Roboter, where like there's like an implicit expectation that a lot of jobs, and also jobs that are deemed like to be creative, might be replaced by some, something. And I mean, I don't know, like I think there's a lot of books to be written about, have been written about the nature of creativity, and might be written about. But this move 37 is actually quite a good example, because why people found it so interesting is because they considered it to be intuitive and kind of like inspired, I don't know, and then the question is like either that is an intuitive thing, or like this, or for Go, because Go is, the thing with Go is that it's kind of not really computable, right? So that's kind of why Go is such a big deal in these things, because it's kind of, there's so many variations as opposed to chess, that it's computationally currently intractable, So this is kind of, there's like too many worlds to consider for the machine. So you need something that kind of is akin to...
But isn't this levels of sophistication?
Say what?
Isn't it, I mean, there's a sort of tacit knowledge, isn't there, that we're sort of talking about, that apparently we have, that we exchange on a different level of being embodied and so on, that the machine might struggle to do. But this is just levels of sophistication. I mean, given enough time and money and engineering prowess, then there's nothing to say that we couldn't arrive at a similarly constructed.
And then I think there's two options. So either something like that shows that a system like that could also have that, you know, or maybe we don't have it anyway, you know.
Yeah.
Maybe our processes like emerge from something that's actually quite banal and like actually really goes down to a very material basis that is actually computationally describable and thus Turing computable, you know. I'm not sure. I mean, it goes like very quickly into very like political fields, you know. And then,
but
like,
I think it's super interesting though, because it's then you then end up with, well, what is it that the question would then sort of that follows that would then become, well, what is it then that constitutes us as humans that's different? Again, I mean, this question keeps coming up, doesn't it? And we keep recalibrating, and it's a social sort of, you know, embodied aspect of it that we don't tend to take into account so much. That may just be basic stuff of we like hanging out with each other. You know? But it might be that that basic, that's what makes us, you know, we're sociable, we are, and we're sociable, we produce as well through those social, you know, groups, and it sounds terribly, you know, it is banal. You know, there's something, but I quite like the banality of it, you know, in that sort of sense. Can you take this away from me?
Actually, I really like that this is kind of a smaller discussion, so thanks.
Yeah, me too.
You can have it back afterwards, so no problem. I wanted to thank you especially of using a quotation to describe consciousness without using some weird neuroscientific wrong understanding like Mark Hansen uses to describe like the whole analogies between the computable brain, the neural networks, and everything is the same. And exactly this point of saying, well, maybe we are not really able to know what consciousness now is in the human mind just because the technology is not good enough yet, but it will be someday, and then we will be able to computate everything else. And all of those analogies are kind of, I mean, I'm kind of a fan of neuroscience works, and they are like always saying we know 1% of how the human mind works. 1%. And that's even like hypothetical in some stances. And I really like that you didn't, because a lot of people are doing it, just when they talk about AI and about the computable consciousness and how our brain is going to be, I don't know, maybe transferred into a computer or something, that it's so simple to just say it's computable. And just to think that maybe this is actually just 120 years in the future that we are able to say now we know about 60% of how the human even works. It's going to be different. And just wanted to say thank you to not use like the shortcut that is able and few right now and kind of on vogue and kind of dangerous, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is like this page is really long. Yeah, and this bit that I quoted is like at the very top, even before the table of contents of the page. Like I very consciously used the one that like doesn't make any assumptions to just show that there's no consensus. I mean, my absolutely non-scientific gut feeling is that it probably is something that emerges from a material process. But
I do think so too.
You know,
but
I mean,
so that is
it's highly hypothetical and I mean, I'm gonna quote a quote because I made a series of films recently called The House in the Sky, and in there Kevin Slavin, who's a professor at MIT Media Lab, recounts meeting a neuroscientist at MIT who basically said that he said like the understanding consciousness could be like putting your ear to a hard drive when Photoshop is loading. You know, and then you hear the hard drive doing something, and you go like, "Oh, that's Photoshop," because every time it sounds the same, you know. But it doesn't tell you anything about how the actual software works. So, and the guy basically said like, "Well, it might be that, it might be the sound, might be it, but it might actually be something that we don't even have a concept for, you know, and that kind of will take another another 100 years of science to actually get a step closer to. On the other hand, 100 years is not much, you know, so that's kind of the thing. And especially, you also have to take into consideration that maybe those machines are going to help speed up the process, you know, so there's there's a lot of kind of like possible acceleration that could happen, but I mean, on the time frame of like human history is actually not a lot. And if you look at the use of tools in agriculture, I mean, that took so long, and these things have progressed so far in like 50 years.
But for me, it's not the point if it's going to be or to happen or when, or is it 2054 or whatever it's going to be. It's really like that for researchers, it's just so simple nowadays to just have a theory that gives you like the easy answer, the easy route, and
But the thing is, I mean, that actually goes back to the singularity question. Like, it's one of these moments, like when it happens, you know, and it's going to be one of these. It's going to be one of these like Copernican moments where basically like the world will not be the same afterwards, because it's kind of, it's like the ultimate blow to the position of the human, and you know, in the universe, basically, because it shows that you're not unique. If somebody else could actually, something else could.
The hypothesis that it already had happened.
Yeah,
and we are just going to know.
And it's but I'm not sure if you cannot necessarily look. If.
I think we have a last question, and then I think we should slowly come to an end, because we are already 50 minutes over time. So.
Okay. Yeah. Then.
There was another. No. Okay. Sorry for killing the discussion.
Did you have more questions?
No, I don't. So I'm just. I think we should come to an end. Sorry. You can continue. It was great in the discussion to actually reiterate the different, I think I counted 4 different recursions occurring in the video. So thanks for that, and thanks for the video, Sascha.
Thank you. And thanks you for sticking around.